All right, I'm unmuted and wow, this is quite an experience. This is the first time I've ever done anything like this. I think I would prefer it if I was seeing everybody's faces and seeing what kind of beverage you're sipping. But since this is a new era, I am still happy to talk to you about birds, my favorite topic. And I'm going to talk a little bit about some thoughts I have on what birds can tell us about our watershed and what they can reveal about floodplain function, because I know the watershed councils are often very concerned with fish and aquatics, but really it's a whole system. And so that's what I'm going to talk about, how birds can tell us about that whole system. But first of all, I want to say you just gotta love birds, right? And I feel very lucky that I get to study birds and talk about birds because they're beautiful, they're entertaining. I mean, look at that chickadee hanging upside down there. They eat insects, and so they help us with pest control, and they eat rodents, so they help us with pest control. And they're beautiful, that I mentioned that, and they sing, which is nice. So they just really brighten up our world, in my opinion. And they're really good to study too. For one thing, an important thing about them is that they're really useful indicators about what's going on in our environment. They have important ecological functions, as I mentioned, so they're a really important part of the system. They disperse seeds, they eat insects, they're prey for animals. So they're a really important part of the system. And another great thing about them is that we understand their habitat associations pretty well. And that's kind of a basic idea that I'm going to come back to, why they're useful indicators, because we know what habitat elements certain species are associated with. And so they're useful for indicating those kinds of habitats. And of course, they're responsive to environmental change. And so if we go out there and do some restoration action, or change the environment in any way, we can expect to see a response from the birds, and we can measure it. So very useful for monitoring in that way. And of course, they're easy to observe because they're so colorful, they're everywhere, and they often advertise that they're present with their songs and calls. They're so useful as indicators, in fact, that the National Park Service has selected birds as a vital sign for their national park monitoring. And a vital sign is something that indicates, an organism that indicates how well the overall environment is doing. And also, they chose birds as a vital sign because there's concern for the population status of many species. There's a lot of declining species. So they want to know how those species are doing in the areas, the natural areas that they manage. Birds also have a lot of public interest, so they can engage the public. They're widely distributed, which means they occur everywhere. And another great thing about them, and why the NPS uses them, is because you can monitor multiple species, the whole bird community, with just one simple protocol, which I'll talk about later. So if the NPS uses them as indicators, there must be something to that.
Joan?
Yes.
Just real quick, just one question. I wanted to, first
Oh,
question
good.
I got there, I just wanted to interject with real quick. We had a request to, if you can, if you are, say, if you do remember, say, if you wouldn't mind pointing out the bird species when you have them on your slides. That was the request we had.
Oh, yes, of course. Let me go back a little bit. That's this one, Wilson's warbler, a migrant that is pretty common in our watershed. Beautiful little insect-eating warbler. And this one that's featured on the National Park Service document is a Clark's nutcracker. We don't have those in our watershed because they occur at high elevations. And I will remember to identify any others that we see. And the next point I was going to make about how wonderful birds are is their cultural and economic importance. So that, as I said before, they're really useful for engaging the public. And this is my a slide of my colleague, Jose Rousseau, who is showing off a little common yellowthroat, it's kind of warbler, to some children during a bio-blitz that we had in Corvallis for the past several years. So yeah, birds are really great at engaging the public and therefore good at raising conservation awareness. So they are one reason I like to include birds in my research and in conservation programs is to promote public investment in the stewardship of these areas. But all that being said, birds are great and all, but what can they tell us about habitat for fish? Because after all, the birds occur in terrestrial environments. They seem kind of removed from the river, at least most of the forest dwelling species. Of course, there are water birds, but I'm mostly talking about the forest dwelling species, the terrestrial species. And so how do they tell us anything about what's going on with fish habitat? And that's what I'd like to explore a little bit tonight. So indicator species are a species or group of species whose function or population or status can reveal the condition of the environment. The proverbial canary in the coal mine, right? So birds can serve to tell us what's going on in the environment. And if we choose indicator species carefully, then they represent attributes that are important to the entire ecosystem. And then we can use the habitat needs can be used to guide conservation planning. So if I know what habitat this American goldfinch is associated with, and I want to promote that kind of habitat, then I can measure how many American goldfinches there are and how they respond. So useful in that way. So I monitor to measure progress towards my goals, towards my restoration goals. And I'll give examples of this later on. So fortunately, there's an organization called Partners in Flight that's their motto is about keeping common birds common. And the partners part comes from the awareness that many of our birds are shared across continents. So the birds that we have breeding here in the summer fly to Central and South America to winter. And so the birds connect us in that way. And this organization, Partners in Flight, forms partnerships with Canada and Mexico and North America to conserve our bird resources. And they've developed some really useful region-specific bird conservation plans. They take a focal species approach to conservation planning and management. So they've identified some species, like I mentioned before, that can really well represent the certain environments. This is an example of the cover of the conservation plan, the conservation strategy for land birds in lowlands and valleys of Western Oregon and Washington. And it names focal species that represent the important habitats we have in the lowlands and valleys, and including riparian habitats. And they selected focal species to represent desired future conditions, ones that are responsive to management actions, and they wanted to be sure that they're cost effective to monitor. And I'll give examples of those species in a moment. This is a Western meadowlark on the cover, which represents grasslands. So that conservation plan has some indicators or focal species. I kind of use those terms interchangeably, focal species and indicators. For my purposes, they mean the same thing. But the conservation plan for Western Oregon and Washington lowlands has a list of indicators for riparian and floodplain forest indicators. And this is how it works, that they can be used to indicate habitat that is in common with fish in aquatic environments. So I'll kind of walk through this. Two species that require large canopy trees in woodlands are the Bullock's oriole and the red-eyed vireo. So you'll find these species where there's tall, big riparian, big trees like cottonwoods and big overstory ash in riparian areas. But of course, they each have a slightly different habitat preferences, because the Bullock's oriole likes scattered large canopy trees in woodlands, and the red-eyed vireo likes a really tight continuous canopy. So these two species indicate the dense canopy of trees in a woodland. And they represent some important ecosystem processes that affect fish. And I've got some of those listed here, including bank stabilization, shading, nutrient input, and structure for the channel when some of those trees eventually fall down. So in this way, it should make the fish happy. If there's habitat for the oriole and the red-eyed vireo, then there's good things happening for the fish too. So that's my little happy face fish. And this is another example. There's a couple of species, actually several species, that are indicators of different kinds of riparian shrublands. So the yellow-breasted chat is a beautiful migratory bird that uses thickets of tall shrubs. And the willow flycatcher is another one that uses tall shrubs. And both these species like dense shrubs under an open canopy. So not much of an overstory. And they also represent ecosystem processes that translate to habitat for fish. So where there's shrubs along the riverbank or along the stream, they provide erosion and runoff control, and they contribute nutrients from the detritus, the falling leaves and insects falling into the water, and they also serve to filter sediment. And so this is how these indicator birds connect to fish habitat. It's really all the same system. And what's good for the birds is also good for the fish. And then when you think about all the species together, if they're all there, then you have all the elements that they need. And these are the 11 focal species that the Partners in Flight plan lists for riparian and floodplain forest habitats. And each of these species represents some key habitat element. As I mentioned, there's several shrub associated species, the willow flycatcher, the yellow-breasted chat, yellow warbler, Swainson's thrush, wren tit. They all use different kinds of shrubs. And then the red-eyed vireo and the Bullock's oriole use the overstory forest. Downy woodpeckers represent the snag components. And then there's the yellow-billed cuckoo, red-shouldered hawk, and Cooper's hawk, which represent the spatial scale that's necessary for these habitat elements to occur on, because they need bigger areas with a variety of these riparian habitats present. So altogether, the bird species indicate a healthy functioning system. So one thing I'd like to point out about the focal species in the Partners in Flight plan is that they are relatively common species. And that has two big advantages for monitoring and conservation work. First of all, if you have common species, then you're able to collect a lot of data on them and easily monitor trends and changes in abundance, changes in presence or absence. And so it provides for robust monitoring data. And then another big advantage is that if you're trying to provide habitat for these species, you don't have to worry about any protected status regulations. So it's not as if you're inviting an endangered species to come on into your restoration area, which will then tie up things legally for any other habitat manipulations you might want to do. So these are all relatively common species. And the species we have here on this slide are the Swainson's thrush, my personal favorite, the willow flycatcher, again, in the bottom left, the yellow warbler, which is a real classic riparian species, and the downy woodpecker over on the bottom right. So one exception to the species being common, the focal species, is the yellow-billed cuckoo. And that species is a special status because even though it used to occur in the Willamette Valley when there were large tracts of floodplain forest, it no longer breeds here. So these are the kind of forests that the yellow-billed cuckoo is associated with. They still occur down in California, but they have a threatened status down there too. And they're occasionally seen along the Columbia River, but they do not breed here in the Willamette Valley. I would love to see enough continuous riparian forest restored so that the yellow-billed cuckoo return to the Willamette River. So we'll be looking for that species. I always have my eye open for it. So,
Joan, I have a question.
Yes.
Sorry,
Yes.
I couldn't go in the Q&A because I'm the panelist, but
Okay.
I wanted to ask you, the yellow-billed cuckoo, is that one of the bird species that lays eggs in other birds' nests? I'm just curious.
Yes, it is a nest parasite. So it will lay its eggs in the nests of other species.
And does that affect its the other birds that it would lay its its eggs and its nest of, would does that loss of the yellow-billed cuckoo, has that affected any other birds?
No, not really, because most birds have evolved with that nest parasite. The really problematic one is the brown-headed cowbird, which is a much worse nest parasite. And the brown-headed cowbird, it's kind of an interesting ecological relationship, because they used to follow the big herds of buffalo around before there were fences, before the West was fenced. And so the cowbirds, for their food, they needed to follow the bison. And so they were actually kind of uncommon. They would come through and parasitize the songbirds' nests in a particular area once every several years or whatever. And now that we have cattle that are stationary on the landscape all the time, then cowbird populations have built up. And so that becomes a problem for native species, but not cuckoos.
I got it. Thanks.
Joan, we have one more cuckoo question real quick. Is it,
Okay.
if you happen to know the minimum area the cuckoo requires as far as say territory or any of that?
No, those kind of questions are different. It's a really good question. I would say that it's on the order of several hundred acres that a cuckoo would want of continuous habitat. And it doesn't all have to be like solid cottonwood forest, because they like some shrub patches, some forests, but it's all continuous natural riparian habitat that they need. And of course, the amount depends on the amount of edge too, but I would say, a block of a couple of hundred acres is probably what they would require. And then of course, not too isolated from other big blocks. So they're definitely a special needs bird. So now that I talked about how useful these birds could be for monitoring, I wanted to spend a little bit of time talking about, thought you might be curious about how we monitor birds. And then I'll tell you about what we're doing out at the Luckiamute State Natural Area. So there's two basic monitoring methods for birds. One is very simple, going out in the woods and conducting audiovisual surveys with your binoculars and writing down birds that you hear and see. And then another method, which gives a different kind of data, is to capture birds in what we call mist nets. And you can see a picture of my colleagues setting up a mist net at Snagboat Bend there on the right. So mist nets are 12 meters long, a couple of meters high, and they are meant to just capture birds, not to get them all tangled up, but they basically have mesh pockets that a bird flies into and drops into the pocket, and then we extract it. And if any of you ever get a chance to come out to our station at Luckiamute State Natural Area and see how we do this, we take a few people at a time every time we go out, and we love to share what we're doing out in the field. So each of these methods returns very different kind of data, so we learn different things. The audio-visual surveys usually we call them point counts, or they can be conducted as transects too, where you would walk along a transect recording what you heard and saw. And they're most useful during the breeding season, because that's when birds are on territories and vocalizing. And so it means you can detect them and count them, because we assume they stay on their territories, at least many of the species that we're surveying. And the kind of data that we can get from this is species presence or absence and abundance estimates. So we know which species are there, and we can get an idea of how many there are by how many we count at our various points. So mist nets have returned a different kind of data, and they have different biases. So mist net surveys can be conducted in just about any season because it doesn't depend on the bird vocalizing. And but it is, well, we can't capture birds when the weather's too cold or too wet, because that gets dangerous for the birds. But basically on any day where the weather's decent enough, we can go out and use mist nets to survey. It is biased towards species that occur lower in the canopy. So we catch a lot of the shrub affiliated species. And it's good at returning data on species presence for those species, for the lower canopy species, and especially for cryptic species. So those that, for instance, in the fall, when birds aren't singing very much, we might not know they're around, but a particular species, but we could catch it in the net, and that's how we would know it's there. The kind of data we can get from mist netting is much more intensive than from audiovisual surveys, because once we have a bird in the hand, we can tell all kinds of things about it, its sex, its age, its body condition, and we put a marker on it, a leg band, and we can, if we recapture that bird later on, we can get survival estimates. The picture in the bottom there is of a song sparrow, a captured song sparrow. We catch a lot of song sparrows, so we have the ability to learn a lot about song sparrows. And they may look like a boring little brown bird, but they're actually really interesting little species. So I'd like to tell you a little bit about the monitoring we've been doing at Luckiamute Research Natural Area. And we've been using both audiovisual surveys and mist netting surveys, but I'm going to focus on the mist netting tonight because that's the really interesting data. And I don't know how many of you are familiar. It's in your watershed, so hopefully a lot of you are familiar with the Luckiamute State Natural Area, but it's situated on the Willamette River at the confluence of the Luckiamute River and the Willamette, and then the Santiam is coming in from the east, between Albany and Salem. And it consists of a great big field surrounded by riparian forest, and with a nice patch of riparian gallery forest extending to the north. And there's restoration, one restoration project has already happened there. In February 2013, they planted the north end of the field to native shrubs. And so we were interested in the response of the birds to the restoration, but our second goal that we were really interested in was how birds might use the Willamette River as a movement corridor during the post-breeding season and for migration. And the reason we're interested in the post-breeding season and what's happening along the Willamette River is because it's a really important but understudied period in the bird's life cycle. So it's a time when young birds are dispersing from their natal habitat. This is a young juvenile Swainson's thrush that a lot of our Swainson's thrushes breed up in the upland conifer forests, but they tend to move down into the riparian areas after they hatch or after they fledge and before they migrate off to Central America. The post-breeding season is also a time when adult birds molt. That means they change out their feathers. Every year they need to grow new feathers because the old ones get worn. And molting is very energetically expensive for birds to replace all those feathers. They're fattening up and preparing for migration, the migratory species. So they really need a productive and protective habitat. And we think that the Willamette River riparian areas offer that, because if you think about it, at the end of the summer, when this is happening, like in August and September, things are pretty dry around here, but along the river, there's still moisture available, and it's still fairly productive habitats. And there's dense shrubs and dense vegetation for young birds to hide in from predators. And then there's a lot of production of fruits and berries and seeds on that vegetation. So we're curious about how this area gets used during the post-breeding season. So a lot of the results that I'm going to show you come from mist netting in August, September, and early October. So our results, I do want to acknowledge my colleague Jose Rousseau here. She's processing a yellow warbler, and this was a busy day in the fall when we were catching lots of birds. I can't really tell what bird I have in my hand. It looks like a Swainson's thrush over there on the left. So what did we find? We've been doing this for 2 years. Actually, I did a pilot year in 2014, but I haven't included those results here because that was kind of a long time ago. But we did 2 years in a row, 2018, 2019, and we had over 1,500 total captures of all bird species combined. So some of those were new and some of those were a few recaptures. The recaptures are like the goal. That's what we're really after, because every time we capture a bird, then we can learn about how it's changed, where it's been, if we capture it in a different place. If we capture it from 1 year to the next, we know it survived that period. So that's the really valuable information. So pretty good capture rate in 2 years of mist netting. And those captures represented 53 species. So there's a lot of interesting species. And this is just at the Luckiamute State Natural Area, remember. So that's a lot of species. And those that included 7 of the focal species that I was mentioning before, 7 of our 11 focal species. The focal species we didn't catch were the Bullock's oriole and the yellow-billed cuckoo, of course, and 2 raptor species, the red-shouldered hawk and the Cooper's hawk. But I don't really expect to catch the raptors because our nets aren't designed to catch raptors. And we did observe the 2 raptor species during our audio visual surveys, so they are there. But the oriole and cuckoo are undetected. The cuckoo, obviously, we didn't really expect it. Maybe when there's more restoration, we can hope for a cuckoo. The oriole, probably not there because we're lacking the scattered overstory trees. So we have a rather continuous canopy of riparian gallery forest there, which is better suited for the red-eyed vireo. And we had a lot of young birds. So it's those young birds dispersing after fledging that I mentioned earlier. They're finding protective cover and hopefully lots of food in the riparian area along the Willamette and Luckiamute rivers there. So our most captured species, the feature species, is the Swainson's thrush. And it might look like kind of a dull bird, but some of you may know that it has one of the most beautiful songs in the Pacific Northwest forests. So if you don't know what it sounds like, I suggest you Google it and listen to a recording, because it's beautiful. And then for sure, you'll hear it next season. They've all migrated now. They're not singing anymore this time of year, but they are a really great species. They come up here, breed, they migrate to Southern Central America, maybe to South America. And we catch a lot of them, so we can learn a lot about these. Over the 2 years, we had 508 captures of Swainson's thrushes, 64% of which were young birds, like the one in the bottom picture there. We can tell they're young because their plumage is all speckled, kind of like baby robin. And we had 6 individuals that were captured between years. So originally banded in 2018 and then recaptured in 2019. So we know that they lived at least 1 year. And I will say that we're not quite finished with our 2020 season yet, but I've looked at some of our recaptures so far, and we have recaught some of those Swainson's thrushes for the 3rd year. So that's pretty cool. It's always nice to know they've survived that amazing journey back and forth between here and South America. And so a cool thing that we learned about response to restoration of native vegetation is this kind of harks back to the survey I did in 2014. And back then I did not catch any chats. Chats were not present on the site. And there were only a couple of willow flycatchers, which were probably migrating through. But when we, since the restoration plantings became established and grew quite a bit between 2013 and 2018, we now have chats and willow flycatchers breeding at the site. So I know we have 2 pairs of yellow-breasted chats because we've caught them, both members of both pairs, several times. And so that's pretty exciting to see that, yes, these indicator species are responding to the restoration of native vegetation. And then I wanted to say a little bit about what our band recoveries reveal, because we've had some interesting band recoveries. And one of the most interesting one was a Swainson's thrush that was originally banded in that first 2014 session, September 9th, 2014, at Luckiamute State Natural Area, which you can see in the map. The big map there on the left is south of Salem. And this bird was recovered on June 13th, 2017 in Lewis County, Washington. So a straight line distance of 125 miles to the north. Now we caught it in the fall, so it was on its way south. And then it obviously had gone back and forth, made its big migration trip back and forth to South America 6 times before it finally met its end in Adna. And the reason we got the band recovery was that it hit a window, and so the band was reported to the banding lab. So very sad that this bird hit a window, but very cool that it survived all this time and made all those trips, and that we can learn about that because we banded it and got the band recovery information back. And if you look at the map, you can see that the route it might possibly have been traveling in its migratory movements included the Willamette River, which goes up between Salem and Portland there. And then the Columbia River takes a sharp bend to the north. And so the bird could have continued following the riparian habitat up there and on up into Washington. So this is the kind of data that we're excited to get from our banding program. And a couple more travel tales. The little common yellow throat on the left, we caught one of those at our Luckiamute station in 2014 in the fall. And then we were banding at 3 stations along the Willamette that season. And we recaptured that bird down at Snagboat Bend, which is in the very the southern yellow circle on that map. So it was on its way south, migratory bird as well. And it was hanging out at Luckiamute and then took another rest stop at Snagboat Bend. So it does suggest that some of these migratory birds use the Willamette River as a corridor for migration or even pre-migration as they're fattening up to move south. And then finally, my last travel tale is of a white-crowned sparrow, which is a bird that winters here, and we have some resident populations. But this bird was also banded at Luckiamute in 2014 fall and was recovered as a window strike bird again in Solano County, California, early the next year. So again, sad that it ended up hitting a window, as so many birds do, but we learned from that that some of these birds, individuals of this species, are migratory, short distance migrants at least, because it was from our site all the way down to California. So we're learning a lot about bird movements, and it's pretty cool. And I put this slide in to remind us of how important it is to consider the full life cycle of birds for conservation purposes. So they breed. Many of the species we think of as ours breed up here in the summertime, but they need to travel along corridors and migratory pathways and find their way down to their wintering grounds and back up again. So that journey for many of these migratory species, a huge journey twice a year, depending on quality habitat that they can find along the way. And I think that our Willamette River corridor may be a crucial link in the annual life cycle for many of these songbird species, based on the work that we've been doing so far and some of our results. So it's really a precious gem, and the restoration that's happening along the river is really contributing to bird conservation in an important way. So into the future of what Jose and I have been talking about would be really cool. We would love to learn more about how the birds are moving and where they're going. And we're learning a little bit, but it's kind of slow going collecting data with band recoveries. And we're looking at this new technology called the Modus Wildlife Tracking System as a potential way to increase our knowledge about bird movements. And this is a really interesting technology, really powerful, that's gotten off to a start in mostly in Eastern Canada and Eastern US. It started in Canada. The idea is that there's these little nano tags that you can attach to a bird, like a Swainson's thrush, as shown here on this poster. And the nanotag emits a signal that's picked up by the tracking station. So every time a bird flies past a tracking station, it's recorded. And the signals being emitted identify the individual birds. So kind of like a barcode that gets read by the stations. And you can see on the map of North America in the background, all the little blue dots are MODIS tracking stations, the network. So it depends on a network because, of course, if you want to know how a bird is moving, you have to pick it up along its journey. And you can see there's a pretty good network in the eastern US. And then if you look on the West Coast, behind the shoulder of the Swainson's thrush modeling the nanotag, you see there's very few blue dots. And my colleague Jose and I think the Willamette River would be a really ideal place to put one of these tracking stations and start to see a network around that because of the evidence we've seen that the birds may well be moving along the Willamette. So our chances of picking up birds as they move would be increased. So this is what our pipe dream is, to eventually have participate in the MODIS network with some stations along the Willamette River. And we just have to get the funding, that's all. So that's what we're thinking about. And that's about all I have. I would love to take some questions. I hope I left plenty of time for questions, and I hope you have enough beverage left so that you don't have to leave before you ask some questions. So thank you very much for your attention.
Sure. Might as well just jump straight in. We've got 2 questions. The first one was right as you were wrapping up anyways, so perfect timing for that. We've got, if you happen to know or can expand on what would be the typical cost of a tracking station like you were just talking about first.
Yes, the typical cost of the MODIS station, I put some notes here. So to install the a station is around $7,000, and then the nanotags to go on the birds cost a few dollars each. So there's that initial investment, and then the maintenance of the station and downloading the data and keeping it working and all that is on the order of $7,000 a year. So in the scheme of things, it's not a lot of money, but yeah, that was a good question. Thanks for asking that.
Absolutely. I was going to say that was a good one, I thought too. And we've got one more follow-up currently right now, and it's a little bit longer, so I'm going to just go ahead and read it directly here for you. Well, what can Oregonians do to help birds and fish in the face of seemingly intractable issues like population growth and global warming? With an extra note, please mention the importance of restoration efforts up and down the Willamette, like at the LSNA, Snagboat Bend, Harkins Lake, and a little extra rooting for support your local watershed council and land trusts.
Yeah, definitely. Well, the restoration work, as I hope I got across in my presentation, the restoration work is really important, and it's really paying off too. I think keeping these native habitats is critical. And it's worth noticing that the Willamette corridor is surrounded by agricultural land in urban areas and suburban areas. It's very developed, but the native habitat along the rivers and the patches are just invaluable for the birds, and the birds can deal with all the development if they have the sanctuaries of some restored areas. So really critically important. When I think about a bird like a Swainson's thrush migrating from Oregon down to Central America and back, I'm just amazed any of them ever survive. with all the hazards along the way. I mean, just like the window strikes, for example, is a huge thing. And there's a lot of products now coming out that are effective at keeping birds from hitting windows, or at least minimizing the number of window strikes. So you could do a lot around your homes to help birds by just making your windows bird safe. And of course, keeping cats inside, in addition to maintaining native habitats, and even just maintaining native plants in your yard that support native insects and shrubs or fruits and berries and seeds that the birds eat. But I do think our watershed councils play a critical role in bringing awareness to these issues and in collaborating on restoration. And I'm really thrilled about the plans that are linking restored areas up and down the Willamette to make what could be a really great corridor for these riparian associated birds.
Fantastic, thanks. And we've got one more currently, and this is going to be one that you practically walked right into. I have been unsuccessful in trying to convince my neighbors to keep their cats indoors or to use a catio. We have about a dozen cats in our neighborhood and they hunt all day long. If you have any suggestions, say to either help convince them or other things like that, I think they'd love to hear them.
Oh boy. Yeah, it's hard. It's really hard. If you can let them know as much as possible about how much cats really do prey on birds, because some people think, oh, my cat doesn't do that, but of course they do. And there's a lot of videos online you could probably find of cats wearing GoPro cameras and showing just how much depredation they do of birds. So awareness of the problem, something that we have resorted to in the past is live trapping cats that come into our yard and prey on birds at our feeder, and taking them to the Humane Society, or even just photographing the cats in our yard and saying in the neighborhood newsletter saying, this cat was preying on birds, and whoever owns it, please control your cat. It's a really tough problem. So yeah. Also, another consideration is if you do feed birds, placement of the feeders. There are ways that you can strategize to place your feeders where they'll be less vulnerable to cat predation. Maybe a little more out in the open where a cat can't hide beneath the feeder. So that's something. Yeah.
Thanks for that one. I was going to say, I'll quickly interject for myself too on that one that you just reminded me. There actually is also a fantastic sort of, definitely a fact and science-based web comic from the oatmeal.com that talks about how much cats murder, and and it actually goes into a fair amount of detail on some of those studies and does have some of those GoPro videos and things like that. And it does present it in a pretty fantastic way for you as well.
Yeah. So maybe share that with your neighbors. It's hard to get through to people because, of course, cats are beloved pets too. So it's hard to think of your beloved pet as a murderer.
Absolutely. We also have one more here. You mentioned 53 species. If you can think of them, can you list some of the more rare species, or did you capture any species that you weren't supposed to find where they were, where you were capturing?
Oh yeah. Well, gosh, out of those 53, yes. So one that comes to mind is the red-eyed vireo, which is actually one of our focal species, but not very common here in the Willamette Valley, or has not been in the past. So that was a really cool one to catch. We have caught some vagrant species, or some that wouldn't be expected. The one that comes to mind is the white-crowned sparrow, which breeds, of course, up in the boreal forest. We've caught species that in the fall that I think of as being associated with upland habitats, not riparian habitats. Things like lazuli buntings, which I didn't really expect to see in riparian forest, but there they were in the post-breeding era. Black-throated gray warblers, I think of as being an upland oaken conifer species, and we catch quite a few of those. And we have caught sharp-shinned hawk, and this spring, I believe it was, we caught a flammulated owl juvenile. So those are just some of the species. We catch a lot of really cool, interesting species.
Awesome. And one more slightly more simple question. How long can the nano tags last?
Oh, sorry. I said flammulated owl. I meant saw-whet owl. Sorry about that. Anyway, how long can the nano tags last? They last about, it kind of depends on how often you set them to give out their signal, I believe. But they have to last for at least 2 migration cycles, so at least a year. So the bird can go south and then come back north and get recorded along the way. Yeah. So I believe that's what they're programmed to last.
I have a question for you, Joan.
Yeah.
I'm wondering if there are researchers doing similar work down in their southern range of their migration cycle in Central and South America, and do you share the information that you get with them and vice versa?
Yes, that's a very good question. There is a program for in Central America, a mist netting program. It's a constant effort, and widely distributed stations where they monitor birds through mist netting. And we do, I personally, I'm not in contact with them, but data is shared. And especially, of course, if they caught one of our banded birds or vice versa, we would know about it. Yeah, we do have our colleagues, and Partners in Flight is a great way to keep in touch with what's going on. There's a good network there between Canada, US, Mexico.
Thank you. And I just wanted to mention also in the chat, I'm sorry, at the very beginning of this program, I thought I was chatting to everybody, and I'm only chatting to Mark and Joan. So I realized that a little while ago, and I did put in a link in the chat. If you scroll up, you'll see a link to the Luckiamute Watershed Council's restoration work that we do in the Luckiamute State Natural Area, where Joan was talking about her bird research. So, you know, you have that link if you'd like to learn more about the kinds of restoration work we're doing there. And I also put in a link to that comic, the oatmeal comic that Mark mentioned about cats, how much they actually kill. So you can look in the chat for those things. And I think, Mark, there's another Q&A question there.
Yeah. Just one more comment. Say, will the talk be available on YouTube? I know we're running it live, but I guess that's more of a question for you, Suzanne, then.
That was, yeah, we are streaming live on YouTube, and I didn't publicize that because I didn't know this is, like I said, the first time that we've ever done this, but it looks like it's working. It's streaming live on YouTube. It will be available on YouTube and also on our website after the fact. So we've been recording it as well. And when you leave the presentation, not only will you get a survey that will pop up in your screen, you'll also be emailed some of that, the links, for instance, to the live recording, or the recording of the live presentation, and also a cool little resource that kind of summarizes a little bit of what Joan was talking about, a PDF brochure about how birds do indicate, are a good indicator species for riparian or floodplain forest health. So you'll get that in the email that you registered to be here with. So are there, another question just popped up.
Yep, looks like I'm gonna read. It's gonna say, are there any bird species that are generally associated with the presence of specific fish species? Ooh, I like that one.
Mhm. Oh, well, you know, I don't study aquatic birds, but I imagine that since some bird species eat fish, that they would be associated with maybe not species specific, but they would definitely prefer to prey on some types of fish based on where they can catch those fish, like osprey and kingfishers, for example. So I don't, you know, they probably prey on whatever fish they can catch, but I think that kingfishers would tend to fish in smaller pools, shallower pools, so they would catch whatever kind of fish hang out in those pools and smaller fish, whereas the osprey fish the main river and like the bigger fish that are in the deeper channels. But as far as the forest birds and the terrestrial birds, I don't think there is any tight association between them and particular species of fish.
Looks like if we have any other questions, now's the time. We've got an empty queue right now. Oh, there we go. Here's one right here. Let's see. Are there any particular species that the Luckiamute Watershed Council would like to see enhanced in riparian settings? The question is coming from someone in the Marys River watershed, and their neighbors are clear cutting Doug fir, and but the creek runs through their property. So is there anything, is there any particular species in, say, sort of, I guess, in this region that you feel are extra important, say that should be a focus right now?
So bird species, is that the question? Which bird species would be a focus in, and it sounded like it was in a Douglas fir dominated habitat?
They clarified asking for, I was going to say, for particular, say, vegetation species, say to help out with the habitat, and then and pretty much at the same time, then sort of, I guess, sort of the opposite question: any bird species you would not want to find that perhaps would indicate a degradation of that habitat.
Yeah. Well, the answer could be pretty simple, that it would be the native species, of vegetation, native shrubs. In particular, I always like to sing the praises of native deciduous shrubs because they support a diversity of insects. They provide a diversity of plant food like seeds, fruits, nuts. And so I'm thinking things like hazel and ocean spray and vaccinium. Those are all great shrubs for the native birds. And as far as for riparian species, like the willow flycatcher and the yellow warbler, love thickets of willow and currant and and what's the other one I'm thinking of? 9-bark, things like that. For species that you may not want to promote, it's probably the non-natives. But things like starlings and the European collared doves, turkeys that compete with our native species. But that's a whole nother topic. Because they seem to like whatever you're providing for the native species.
And if I might put a plug in for the Soil and Water Conservation District's native plant sales. Mark, is the SWCD native plant sale still going on right now?
Yes, I was going to say we've got say the first part of our 2-part sale say is up and available right now. Say all of the say the bulbs and other flowering forbs are say up on sale right now. The bare roots for some more of the woody shrubs and things like that, the natives will be coming online a little bit later. But definitely if you check out the Polk SWCD's webpage, we have got we've got the online order form for that ready to go right now. And thank you for plugging that link there in there, Suzanne. I think we answered these, but I was gonna say I'm just
and I
checking.
can't forget our partners at Benton too, at bentonplants.org, great place to shop too for native plants.
Yes, I was going to say that sales on different days, whichever is more convenient for you. Yes, go for it. And then I think we covered the two quick follow-ups. Red currant was one of the species you mentioned as well. So I think that one's covered. And we've got one more here. I've always heard snowberry is a great late season forage for birds, but rarely see them eating it. Do our native birds actually use snowberry that much?
You know, I wondered the same thing, but I think that the dogs are getting restless. I think that it's a very late season. So after the berries have really well aged, practically in the spring, I think that's when the birds will eat them. And I think one species that does eat it is the spotted towhee. So I suspect some of the other sparrows eat it as well. But yeah, that's a really good question. I'm going to look into that a little more.
We had one person in the chat mention ruffed grouse consuming the snowberries right now.
Oh, yeah. I hardly ever see ruffed grouse anymore, but there's plenty of snowberry around for them.
Yeah.
Snowberry is a great shrub, though. Aside from the berries, it provides really nice cover. The towhees love it.
See a few more questions popping up in the Q&A.
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think maybe we just lost a chunk with a couple of the barks there. That was the spotted towhees, I believe that was the one you were saying. I think that got clarified just in the chat as well too. And we got some other folks jumping in with with the Ribes sanguinum and the and the ovatum as good species as well there as well. If you agree with that, I think that covers those.
Yep. Nice.
All right. In that case, the question queue is cleared currently. If we've got any further along, or if there's anything else in the chat that I'm not necessarily seeing or picking up just yet, but I think that might be it, unless we've got a couple extra follow-ups. I'll give it a moment or two.
Yeah, we've got a last call here for any more questions for Joan or any other topic that you might be wondering about after this presentation. And as you're thinking of any burning questions that you might still have, I do want to, I think I just mentioned it, but I'm going to mention it again, that there will be a survey, and please fill out, because as I said, this is our first Sips of Science on a virtual format. Thanks to COVID, we are adapting in new and exciting ways, and this is a new one for us. So we plan on having several more this season in Sips and Science presentations. And if you'd like to be on our mailing list to find out more about those, go to our website. It's again, it's if you scroll up, I'll type it again, but it's www.luckiamutelwc.org. And I'll put it in the chat for you, and you can sign up to be on our mailing list and hear more about our Sips and Science and other events that we have coming up. So there it is in the chat, and look at that. We have some more questions in the chat, in the question and answer.
Yep, looks like we've got at least one more say here. We got a thank you or two, but we'll also add here, is it in our area here, do we have good habitat for California condors?
Do we have good habitat for California condors? I think we probably do. They used to occur, they used to forage along the coast on dead sea mammals that washed up on the beach. And I believe Lewis and Clark saw them too in the Columbia Gorge. So yeah, it is good habitat, except the big problem for California condors is lead shot, and that is devastating for them. So when they forage on things like deer and elk that have been shot with lead shot and maybe wounded and run off, then that's poisonous. And because they're long-lived, it builds up in their body tissues, and it has a lot of pretty bad physical consequences. So if we got rid of lead shot, then we would have good habitat for California condors.
All right, well, I was gonna say this one's really interesting here. I'm gonna let this one just pop in here just because this one looks fun. The turkey vultures seem really hungry. Are they?
Always. They're always hungry. Most birds are always hungry. Most birds are living pretty close to the edge of survival. And so, yes, they're hungry. And I mean, if you had to live on dead skunks on the road, wouldn't you be hungry too? Yeah, they work pretty hard, but you know, turkey vultures are very efficient flyers. They don't spend much energy on flying. As big and bulky as they are, they know how to catch those thermals and soar way up there, and they have a good sense of smell. When they smell something stinky, then they come down and feast. But yeah, I think they're probably hungry a lot of the time. But
I've always been told the one of the best ways to say if you're looking around at what's flying around, there's a good chance it's a turkey vulture if it's flying around like it's drunk, because all it's doing is just riding thermal.
Yep. They have that characteristic tipsy flight. Yeah, but they seem like a pretty successful species to me. And they're also one of the first, they're a migratory species, but one of the first ones to return in the spring and one of the last to leave in the autumn. So you can pretty much see turkey vultures almost any time of year. It gets hard to see them between November and February, but you can still see them. And on a nice day where there's a nice weather over the West Coast, they'll just come up from California for the day to see what died up here.
All right, well, we're coming close to 8 o'clock, and again, if there's somebody with the last question that they're typing away, I'll give a few minutes, but in the meantime, I just want to thank everyone. And oh, there we go. What's that? I see one there. Oh, comment about the commuters. Yeah, the turkey vulture commuters. But yeah, thank you all for attending. And I appreciate, of course, Joan being here, Dr. Joan Hagar. Thank you so much. This was a really an amazing look into what birds can tell us, even those of us that aren't as you know, well versed in bird ID. I feel like you've led us into a world that we don't always get to see. And I can attest to the amazingness of holding you know, these fragile little creatures in your hand when I went out to visit at the Luckiamute State Natural Area mist netting experience, and how incredible that was. And if any of you have an opportunity to, you know, go on a kind of a research, a look behind the scenes on one of the research expeditions that Joan and Jose do there at LSNA, I encourage you to do that. Or just go and learn more about birds. Join a birding group, join the Audubon, local Audubon group, and learn more about birds, and you will not be disappointed. And I also want to thank you, Mark, for handling Q&A and being right on top of all those questions. And again, I thank you so much for our partners at Polk Soil and Water Conservation District, Benton Soil and Water Conservation District, and Willamette Habitat Restoration Fund for making this possible. Thank you so much. And thank you all for attending and joining us tonight. And I hope you'll join us again for our next Sips of Science, which will be November 18th. Go to our website for more info.
Thank you so
Goodbye,
much, Suzanne.
everyone.
Yeah.